This mediated relation is thus a syllogism in which the individuality initially fixed in its antithesis to the in itself is united with this other extreme only through a third term. Through this middle term, the one extreme, the unchangeable, is brought into relation with the unessential consciousness, which equally is brought into relation with the unchangeable only through this middle term. Thus, the middle term is one which presents the two extremes to one another and ministers to each in its dealings with the other. This middle term is itself a conscious being, the mediator, for it is an action which mediates consciousness as such. The content of this action is the extinction of its particular individuality, which consciousness is undertaking. The term that immediately catches the reader's attention in this paragraph 227 is, I think, syllogism, or in German, Schluss, which has this connotation of bringing things together and holding them, binding them together. And as I remarked previously in some of the earlier videos, when you see this term syllogism, you don't want to automatically associate what Hegel is doing with the Aristotelian or scholastic use of the syllogism as you might find it in the beginning of a logic textbook, where you've got, these three propositions, one of which is the conclusion, the other two of which are the premises, and there's, very hard and fast rules for figuring out whether they're valid or invalid. Hegel means something a bit different. He transforms the syllogism, and again, as I remarked, if you want to see more about that, you want to look at his Science of Logic. But we're going to skip that right here, in part so we can focus on exactly what he's trying to get at. So he talks about a middle term bringing together two extremes, and that is what occurs in a syllogism. There, Hegel does have something, explicitly in common with Aristotle and all of his successors. So what is actually connecting them, and how is it connecting them? That's what we want to see. He says this mediated relation, so this mediating relation, is a syllogism in which individuality is one polarity of it, initially fixed in its antithesis to the in itself, the essential, the universal, is united with this other extreme through a third term. And that's what this mediating middle term is doing. So he says, through this middle term, the one extreme, the unchangeable, right on this side, is brought into relation with individuality, which is the unessential consciousness. And we've seen this play itself out already quite a bit. This is not something radically new to us. And he says, thus this middle term is one which presents the two extremes to one another. That's where it gets really interesting. It presents these two extremes to one another. It's not just a passive binding of them. This isn't a purely logical relation as in, concepts in our heads or judgments or propositions that are then aligned with each other and we can put down on a piece of paper. What's happening here is actually much more dynamic. The middle term itself is, as Hegel's going to say, a conscious being itself, right? And he talks about it as ministering. The German there is actually less verbal and more of a noun. He talks about it as a Diener, der gegenseitige Diener, which presents these two to each other, or mediates the two. Dienen means to serve, to minister, to take care of. It's similar to other words in other languages that mean the same thing of taking care of. So there's a relationship here where this middle term is able to bring together what has been throughout the entirety of the unhappy consciousness, constantly at odds, trying to align with each other, and then one overpowers the other or slips away from the other. This is what can hold them together. Now, what happens with that? He says, this middle term is a conscious being, for it is an action which mediates consciousness as such. Now, what happens when that happens? The content of this action is the extinction of its particular individuality which consciousness is undertaking. So that's a problem. And what we're going to see in the next two paragraphs is grappling with this problem. Something that has happened in the previous paragraphs where the individual becomes nothing in relation to the essential, except now it's happening in terms of the middle term, which is itself a consciousness. In the mediator, then, this consciousness frees itself from action and enjoyment so far as they regard it as its own. As a separate independent extreme, it rejects the essence of its will and casts upon the mediator, or minister, priest, its own freedom of decision, and herewith the responsibility for its own action. This mediator, having a direct relationship with the unchangeable being, ministers by giving advice on what is right. The action, since it follows upon the decision of someone else, ceases, as regards the doing or willing of it, to be its own. But there is still left to the unessential consciousness the objective aspect, that is, the fruit of its labor and its enjoyment. These, therefore, it rejects as well, and just as it renounces its will, so it renounces the actuality it received in work and enjoyment. It renounces them partly as identified with the truth it has attained regarding its own self-conscious independence, inasmuch as what it does is foreign to it, a thinking and speaking of what is meaningless to it. Partly as identified with external possessions, when it gives away part of what it has acquired through work, and partly also as identified with the enjoyment it has had, when in its fastings and mortifications it once more completely denies itself that enjoyment. In paragraph 228, Hegel is working further into the implications of this mediator or mediating term that he's going to call, on the one hand, a mitte, means, a thing in the middle, and also a diener, in a certain sense a servant, but the kind of servant that becomes, in many respects, also the master. So Miller is going to translate this a little bit paraphrastically as the minister or even as the priest. That's in line with what Hegel has in mind here, given the other things that he's talking about and given the context in which he's writing. But this could apply not only to the historical consciousness that's developing, but to people in our own time who have some sort of mediator who they're putting the responsibility and giving their own action, their own will over towards. Now, he talks about these three terms again, and we're not that concerned with the other extreme term, the unchangeable, the essential, the universal. Why? Because the mediator is actually functioning here to be the go-between and to speak on part of the unchangeable. So the unchangeable doesn't do much of anything here. Instead, most of the doing, interestingly enough, is happening on the side of the individual consciousness who isn't taking responsibility for what they are and is instead putting that onto the mediator. So let's take a look at how this happens. He says, in the mediator, this consciousness frees itself from action and enjoyment, from tun and genus, insofar as they are regarded as its own. So action and enjoyment are still happening. The question is, where are they happening, or who is doing the acting, and who actually gets to do the enjoyment? He goes on and he says, as a separate independent extreme, it rejects the essence of its will. Now, this is particularly important to look at. So it continues to have its own will, right? Because it couldn't choose anything, and it couldn't do anything, or desire anything, and actually enjoy anything, if it didn't have its own will, and indeed, as we've seen before, a faculty of will. But it takes the essence, the Wesen, the being of its will, and it casts it onto the mediator. So there's a kind of subterfuge going on here, because it has to be willing that in order to do that, but it's concealing from itself the fact that it has done that, and it takes that to be what the mediator itself just is, or how the mediator works in relation to the miserable, unhappy consciousness over here. So he says, it casts upon the mediator its own freedom of decision. So it casts its freedom and also responsibility. The term that's being translated as responsibility there is Eigenheit, its own particularity, its own selfness, its own coming from itself. It places that in the hands of the mediator and expects something else in return. So what does the mediator do? Well, the mediator is connected with the unchangeable. That is a direct relationship with it, as opposed to an indirect mediated relationship. And how does it function? It ministers by giving advice on what is right, or counseling on what is right. Counseling on what is true, how the will ought to be oriented, what sort of action ought to take place, what kind of enjoyment is licit enjoyment, and what kind of enjoyment is illicit or forbidden. So he says that this action, now it's the action actually on the part of individual consciousness, but it's portrayed as coming from over here. This action, since it follows on the decision of someone else, ceases as regards the doing or the willing of it to be its own. Individual consciousness gets to, in a certain sense, get itself off the hook by saying, well, it's not really my decision, I'm just following the rules, or I'm following what my spiritual director is saying, or I'm following what my guru is saying, or pick whoever else you want. I'm following what, so-and-so, the great master has said I ought to do. This is one very common way of avoiding freedom and responsibility while using one's freedom to do that. So he goes on and he says, that has to do with the action part, right? What about the enjoyment part? Here's where it gets even more tangible. He says, there's still left to the unessential consciousness the objective aspect. The unhappy individual consciousness works, it engages in action, right? It does Arbeit, it does tun, right? In German, it does doing, and there's something that's produced by that. It objectifies things in the world, it objectifies itself through its labor into the world. Then it gets to enjoy that, right? No, it doesn't. Instead, it sacrifices it, it gives it up, he says. The fruit of its labor and its enjoyment, it rejects these as well. Just as it renounces its will, it renounces the actuality, and I put here actuality of will because it is the actuality of the will. The will can be understood in several different ways. It's the faculty by which we make choices. It's also, in a certain sense, the product of those choices. That is where our will is expressed. So he goes on and he says, it renounces this actuality that it has received in work and enjoyment. It renounces them partly as identified with the truth it has attained regarding its own self-conscious independence. By renouncing that portion, not only of its enjoyment, but also of its action, it's giving over, again, just as it was here, its freedom and responsibility, its independence. It's treating this as if it's independent and itself as if it's merely dependent upon the independent being. We've seen this before, right? In the dialectic of master and slave, independent, dependent. We've seen this before in other conditions as well. This is going to be a recurring dynamic. So he says, it renounces them, partly as identified with this truth, and in as much as it does what is foreign to it, a thinking and speaking of what is meaningless to it. So it's still willing, it's still doing, it's still thinking, but what it's doing for itself is the lesser part. It's the part that doesn't really matter, doesn't really make sense, as we saw in previous paragraphs, is a nothingness, or an expression of nothingness in relation not only now to the unchangeable, but in relation to the mediator who gets to do the real thing, the stuff that really matters. And he goes on and he says, how does this take place determinately? As identified with external possessions, it gives away part of what it has acquired through work, and partly also as identified with the enjoyment it has had. In its fastings and mortifications, it once more completely denies itself that enjoyment. So there's a double movement there, right? It gives up part of what it attains through its work, right, to the mediator, to the mediator who's supposed to be standing in for the unchangeable. And then what it does still possess, it doesn't fully enjoy that either, because it engages in willful practices of depriving itself of its enjoyment, fasting and mortifications, giving up things that, in a certain sense, it doesn't have to give up. Now, this is actually going to be a positive move, although it seems very negative, as the next paragraph is going to show us. Through these moments of surrender, first of its right to decide for itself, and then of its property and enjoyment, and finally, through the positive moment of practicing what it does not understand, it truly and completely deprives itself of the consciousness of inner and outer freedom, of the actuality in which consciousness exists for itself. It has the certainty of having truly divested itself of its I and of having turned its immediate self-consciousness into a thing, into an objective existence. Only through this actual sacrifice could it demonstrate this self-renunciation, for only therein does the deception vanish which lies in the inner acknowledgement of gratitude through heart, sentiment, and tongue, an acknowledgement which indeed disclaims all power pertaining to its own independent existence, ascribing it all to a gift from above, but which in this very disclaimer holds on to its own particular existence, does so outwardly in the possessions it does not surrender, inwardly in the consciousness of the decision it has itself made, and in the consciousness of its content which it has itself determined, which it has not exchanged for one thing coming from outside, which last would fill it up with what is meaningless for it. We've now arrived at the penultimate paragraph of this entire section of consciousness, paragraph 229. And now we're not looking at a dyadic relationship of the unchangeable consciousness on one side and the individual consciousness on the other side, as we saw through much of the unhappy consciousness. Instead now it's the mediating consciousness that's occupying that other polarity. And much of the agency that's occurring is happening on this side, but it's still caught in a kind of self-deception, as we're going to see, that it's in the process of working out. So he talks about these moments of surrender. First, of the right to decide for itself, to arrive at literally conclusions or determinations or judgments, right? Entschlüsse. And then its own property and enjoyment. And then finally, through, as Miller has here, the positive moment of practicing what it does not understand, doing what it doesn't understand, because the mediating consciousness says, well, you need to do this. It gives the counsel, as we saw in the last paragraph. What happens? There's a sacrifice on the part of the subject going on, the subject who is the individual consciousness. Now, the individual consciousness, as Hegel's saying, comes to no longer treat itself in doing so as an I. And we saw that there's a bit of self-deception involved there. It is willing, it is doing this on its own side, but it's concealing from itself its own involvement in that, and instead treats itself, as Hegel says, as a thing. Now that's not a facade that can truly be maintained. So he says, it deprives itself of the consciousness of inner and outer freedom. Through all of these different transformations and abnegations that we've seen, what it's doing, what consciousness is doing, is using its freedom, using the freedom that it actually does possess, to deprive itself of its inner freedom, its freedom of willing, its freedom of coming to conclusions, and its outer freedom, the external products of its freedom, not only in terms of giving up some of its property, but even in terms of enjoying what it is derived through the fruits of its own work. So, can this be maintained? He says it has the certainty of having truly divested itself of its I. It lets the mediator be the one who gets to say I. It treats itself as a thing, turned its immediate self-consciousness into a thing, into an objective existence. Again, we have seen this process working itself out. Something similar occurred in the earlier dialectics in this section, right? So then it says, only through this actual sacrifice could it demonstrate this self-renunciation. So you could say, well, why go through all this dialectical movement and hiding from itself the fact that it itself is the consciousness on all the different sides? Why doesn't it just cut to the chase? Well, it needed to work through all of this in order to be able to arrive at the other side. There's no shortcut, you could say, within the Hegelian dialectic. Not even for us in processing it. Well, maybe there is a shortcut in that Hegel gave us the blueprint and the roadmap, right? Assuming that he's actually taking us on the right path, which is a big assumption. That's a side comment. So he goes on and he says, therein the deception vanishes, which lies in the inner acknowledgement of gratitude. What is he talking about there? Well, remember that we saw when there is the expression of thanks, the giving of thanks, that giving itself is a thanks in relation to another giving that is supposed to have preceded it. And the expression of gratitude is supposed to be an acknowledgement of dependency, an acknowledgement that the essential is on the other side, and one is just, this lowly worm that has nothing to bring to the table. Oh, thank you for giving me faculties that I can use to do things. Thank you for giving me the very gifts of the possibilities, etc., etc. Right? We can go on and on and on. I am not worthy, right, is the sense. But really, gratitude itself and the giving of thanks, as we saw in earlier passages, conceals the fact that the initiative comes on the side of the one who shows gratitude, and the one who shows gratitude in certain respects is greater than the one who gives. So there was a deception involved there, as he says, and it's a deception that has to do with these three modalities of heart. We saw how important the sentiment of the heart was. And then there's sentiment itself, right? And then there is expression. In Miller's translation, it's tongue, but it's literally in German Mund, right? So verbal expression. And think about what devotion involves. There is the heart itself, the feeling. There is the way that one is, thinking about this, the Gemüte in this. And then there is the mouth, the verbal expression, what it is that one is saying, what one is doing with that organ, right? So this allows that deception to be stripped away, to be overcome. And he says, an acknowledgement which disclaims all power pertaining to its own independent existence, ascribing it all to a gift from above, but which in this very disclaimer holds on to its particular existence. So this is a very important point. Instead of just treating itself as a thing, as a mere object, which is impossible anyway, right? Because a subject can't merely be an object insofar as it is understanding as itself as an object. It is acting as a subject in that very thinking, in that very judging, in that very even feeling itself to be merely an object. So it does hold on to its own particular existence. It holds something back. The sacrifice is as complete as it could be because not everything can be stripped away or nullified in the process. What does it hold on to? It holds on to some of its property. So if we put this in terms of religious belief and action, all that, the religious believer gives up some of his property to the religious institution, whether it be the church or the community, pick whatever you like, right? Same thing in any particular religion, the temple, the Gurdwara, right? So they give up some of their property, but they hold on to some of it. The some of it that they're allowed to keep, because they've given up their freedom of making that judgment to the mediator, they get to enjoy some of it, and some of it they don't get to enjoy. They have to give some of it up in fasting or mortification or just not practicing certain things, right? But they do get to enjoy some of it. And that some of it that they do get to enjoy is theirs. That is part of their particular existence. They are not just a thing in doing so. Even if they are acting, as we saw in earlier passages, like what they think to be a merely animal existence, insofar as they can feel themselves to be living a merely animal existence, they are not merely animals, right? We can also talk in terms of decision. Now this is where we get to the root of the deception, right? So they gave up the right to decide for themselves. Or did they? Were they making a decision in giving up the right to decide for themselves? Or were they deciding that that was a good thing to do? When somebody calls them to question, says, why are you listening to those priests? Why are you listening to those ministers? Why are you listening to the imam? They actually say, I think that's a good thing for me to do. They don't just say, well, it's, I'm a thing. I can't do nothing but be a thing. They say, well, I think that's the better path for me. Insofar as they're doing that, they have reserved some of their own judgment, haven't they? And then, as Hegel's going to talk about in this kind of particularly peculiar way, they reserve some of the content. What does that mean? The inhalt, right? He says they have reserved this consciousness of its content, which it has itself determined. Well, what does that mean? That's identity. That's who one is through what one does and what one desires and what one enjoys. The content of consciousness. One is conscious of this content, but that consciousness is a consciousness of the content of consciousness. One is conscious of what one is actually doing, what one has done, what one is intending to do. One is conscious of the desires, the willing, the choices, the directionality, we could say. One is conscious of the things that one actually has in one's life, whether it be a tie or a pair of glasses or a chalkboard. Those are still part of my consciousness, no matter, even if I decide I'm going to do these for the greater glory of Hegel, right? And I give everything up to Hegel, the great mediator, which is one way you could look at this. I'm still the one who holds on to this. I'm the one who's shooting this video, and the subterfuge, or deception, as I've called it so far, is the concealment of the fact that one is actually doing that. The person, the subject, is not just a thing, the individual is not just a thing, but is a subject, just like the I of the mediator. So he goes on and he says, it hasn't exchanged this content for one coming from the outside, which would just fill it up with what is meaningless for it. Instead, if it thinks about it, its own content is, in fact, meaningful for it.